routine flight takes an unexpected turn when a confident black woman is confronted with a challenge she never anticipated mid-air. As tension rises, the entire first-class cabin is left in stunned silence, their preconceived notions shattered in a single moment. What exactly happened in that aisle, and why did her response leave passengers rethinking everything they thought they knew? Let us know in the comments section below. Christina Pearson adjusted her sunglasses as she strode through the airport terminal, her designer carry-on gliding smoothly behind her. She wasn't in the mood for delays, detours, or unnecessary conversations. The trip from San Francisco to New York was supposed to be simple. A direct flight, 5 uninterrupted hours, then straight to her hotel. The terminal buzzed with travelers, each absorbed in their own pre-flight rituals. A businessman barked orders into his Bluetooth headset while sipping on burnt coffee. A mother wrangled 2 hyperactive toddlers, and a group of young women in matching sweatshirts giggled over their upcoming bachelorette trip. Christina moved past them effortlessly, her steps deliberate. Years of navigating corporate spaces had conditioned her to walk with purpose, to own every room, every hallway, every board meeting. Airports were no different. At the first-class counter, a young gate agent scanned her boarding pass and handed it back with a polite smile. "Enjoy your flight, Miss Pearson." Christina nodded and made her way down the jet bridge, stepping into the luxurious interior of the plane. Plush leather seats, fresh orchids in vases, the unmistakable scent of high-end cabin service. It was the standard experience she had grown accustomed to. She slid into seat 2A, a coveted window spot, and exhaled slowly. The hum of the aircraft, the controlled temperature, the sheer indulgence of first class. This was her sanctuary before another whirlwind of business meetings. Just as she was adjusting her seat, a flight attendant approached. Tall, blonde, and immaculately dressed, the woman smiled, though something about it felt forced. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said, her tone polite but clipped. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Christina blinked, then glanced at her ticket resting on her lap. 2A, first class, nonstop to JFK. Nothing to question. She looked back at the attendant, raising an eyebrow. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The woman's smile faltered. "I just wanted to confirm. We sometimes have—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Mix-ups." Christina's jaw tightened. "A mix-up, right." She'd seen this before. Felt it before. The unspoken disbelief, the silent second-guessing, the subtle but insidious assumption that she couldn't possibly belong. She leaned back in her seat, crossing her legs. "I assume you're asking the other passengers the same question?" The attendant's eyes darted toward the white businessman in 2B, who had just been served a glass of prelate champagne, without any questioning. Her mouth opened slightly, as if searching for an excuse, but none came. Christina held her gaze. "I'll take a mimosa, no ice," she said smoothly, voice unwavering. "Since we're confirming things, I want to make sure the service in first class is also what I paid for." A beat of silence. The attendant blinked, her professional mask slipping just slightly, before she forced a nod. "Of course, right away." She turned sharply, heels clicking against the carpeted floor as she retreated toward the galley. Christina inhaled slowly, pressing her fingers into the armrest. Every single time. She was used to this, whether it was an upscale boutique assuming she was just browsing, a doorman questioning whether she actually lived in the high-rise she owned, or the stunned expressions when she pulled up in her electric Porsche Taycan, dressed in tailored luxury. It was exhausting, and today on a 5-hour flight she was not in the mood. A chuckle came from her right. "Damn," said the man in 2B, setting his champagne down. "That was impressive." She turned her head slightly. He was in his early 40s, salt and pepper beard trimmed to precision, navy blazer over a crisp white tee, casual yet unmistakably wealthy. His watch alone was worth 5 figures. Christina exhaled, shaking her head. It shouldn't have to be. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Another flight attendant approached, this time a younger man, eager to avoid further embarrassment. Your mimosa, Miss Pearson. She accepted it with a cool smile, fingers wrapping around the crystal glass. The plane continued boarding, the first-class cabin filling with well-dressed executives, retired elites, and a couple of influencers already filming their in-flight experience for social media. Christina took a slow sip, feeling the cold citrus against her tongue. The flight hadn't even taken off yet, and already she had been made to feel like she didn't belong. Fine. If that's how they wanted to play it, she had no problem reminding them exactly who she was. The flight was nearly full now, the last few passengers making their way down the aisle. Overhead compartments clicked shut, the sounds of seatbelts fastening in quick succession filling the cabin. Christina took another measured sip of her mimosa, rolling the cool liquid across her tongue, letting it settle before swallowing. She wasn't going to let that little exchange ruin her flight. She had worked too hard, pushed through too many obstacles to let a microaggression from an overzealous flight attendant dictate her mood. She felt the weight of a lingering gaze on her and turned slightly. 2B was watching her again, his expression unreadable. Still impressed? She asked, keeping her voice even. Still thinking, he replied, leaning back in his seat. About. He shrugged. How people react when they see what they don't expect. She studied him, trying to decipher if he was attempting to challenge her or if he actually understood. He didn't look like the type to blindly dismiss things, but then again, she had been wrong before. And what exactly did you expect when you saw me in this seat? She asked. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. That you belonged here. She exhaled through her nose, neither pleased nor convinced. Then I guess you're in the minority. His smirk faded slightly, replaced by something more thoughtful. Before he could respond, the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came over the speaker, welcoming passengers aboard and confirming their flight time to JF. Christina turned her attention back to the aisle just in time to see the flight attendant, Jennifer, according to her name tag, whispering something to her colleague near the galley. They glanced in her direction, then quickly looked away when they noticed her staring. Typical. She had lived this scene too many times before. They weren't whispering about 2B. They weren't whispering about the older white woman in 3A who had boarded with an oversized Louis Vuitton tote and an air of entitlement. They weren't whispering about the young, scruffy entrepreneur type in 4C who was already loudly explaining to his seatmate how his startup was about to disrupt the industry. No, she was the topic. She set her mimosa down and pressed her fingers against her temples, inhaling deeply. It wasn't worth it. Not today. A few minutes later, the plane pushed back from the gate, the flight attendants running through their safety demonstrations as the engines rumbled to life. Christina kept her focus on the window, watching the tarmac lights blur past as they taxied toward the runway. The moment the wheels left the ground, she felt her body sink slightly into the seat, the familiar rush of takeoff pressing her back. It was a feeling she had always loved. The weightlessness, the quiet moment before the plane steadied, before the world below became nothing more than distant lights and fading skylines. She closed her eyes for a second, centering herself. When she opened them, Jennifer was standing in front of her row again. Miss Pearson? The flight attendant's voice was pleasant. Too pleasant. Like someone trying to smooth over something that didn't need smoothing. Christina didn't react immediately. She took her time, turned her head slowly, met Jennifer's gaze with quiet patience. Yeah? Jennifer hesitated, then, with a practiced smile, she said, We have a passenger in economy who was hoping to switch seats with you. Would you be willing to accommodate? The words landed like a slap, even though Jennifer had delivered them in a sugar-coated tone. Accommodate? Christina blinked, just once, before setting her mimosa aside completely. Let me get this straight, she said, voice controlled. You're asking me, a first-class passenger, to give up my seat? Jennifer's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "It's just a request, of course. You don't have to." "No," Christina cut in, tilting her head slightly. "I want to know why." Jennifer's lips parted, then pressed together into a thin line. She hesitated just a fraction too long before responding. "It's for a mother with a child. She was hoping for a more comfortable seat." Christina exhaled sharply through her nose. A mother with a child. Right. A classic play, an appeal to sympathy, a situation where saying no automatically cast her in a bad light, and yet the flight was full of first-class passengers. Had Jennifer asked any of them? From the corner of her eye, she saw 2B watching. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but she could feel his presence as if he were standing right beside her. Christina uncrossed her legs and leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. "You know," she said smoothly, "I find that interesting." Jennifer blinked. I'm sorry?" "I find it interesting," Christina repeated, "because there are 12 seats in this cabin, and yet, somehow, I'm the one being asked to accommodate." Jennifer's face twitched, just slightly. "This was just a request, ma'am," she said again, her voice thinner now. "It's completely voluntary." "Then my voluntary answer is no," Christina said evenly, tilting her head. Jennifer's smile remained in place, but her eyes had changed. "Well, I appreciate you considering it," she said, voice clipped now, and turned on her heel before disappearing into the galley. Christina exhaled slowly and turned back toward the window. A low chuckle from 2B made her glance sideways. "That was fun to watch," he said, smirking. Christina arched a brow. "Glad I could entertain you." He lifted his champagne glass in a mock toast. "Oh, I wasn't laughing at you." She studied him for a moment, then looked down at her mimosa, suddenly no longer interested in it. For the next hour she kept her focus on her laptop, answering emails and reviewing presentation notes. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, interrupted only by the occasional clink of glassware or the murmur of hushed conversations. Then, about halfway through the flight, Jennifer returned. This time, her expression was more controlled, her smile tighter. "Miss Pearson, I'd like to offer you a complimentary dessert or another drink," she said. Christina looked at her, unimpressed. Jennifer continued, her voice softer now. "And I apologize if I offended you earlier. It was never my intention." A beat of silence stretched between them. Christina studied the woman's face, searching for any sign of genuine remorse. She didn't find much. She could accept the apology. She could make it easy. She could nod, say thank you, let it slide. Or she could remind Jennifer of something. Christina leaned back, exuding the kind of calm that came with knowing she didn't have to prove herself to anyone. "I'll take a creme brulee," she said, her voice smooth, unwavering, "and a refill on the mimosa, no ice." Jennifer blinked, then nodded quickly. "Of course, ma'am, right away." As the flight attendant walked away, 2B chuckled again. "You enjoy making people sweat, don't you?" Christina finally smirked. "I enjoy reminding people how to do their jobs correctly." She turned back to her laptop, feeling the weight of 2B's gaze still on her. But this time, it wasn't just amusement she saw in his eyes. It was respect. The plane had settled into its cruising altitude, and the cabin was quiet aside from the soft rustle of newspapers and the occasional clink of cutlery against fine china. Christina had resumed her work, typing efficiently on her laptop while the rest of first class eased into the lull of the flight. She wasn't interested in small talk, wasn't interested in further interactions with the flight attendant, and certainly wasn't interested in entertaining the curiosity of the man in 2B. But he was still watching her. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that told her he was trying to figure something out. Eventually he spoke. "You handled that well." She didn't look up. "Handled what?" He smirked. "The thing with the flight attendant. I thought you might have gone off on her." Christina let out a quiet laugh, just a breath, really, as she clicked on the next document in her inbox. And why would you think that? Because you could have. She turned slightly, looking at him for the first time in a while. He had a relaxed confidence about him, his blazer unbuttoned now, his watch glinting slightly in the cabin light. There was no mockery in his tone, no sarcasm, just observation. I could have, she admitted. But that's not how you win. His brow lifted slightly, intrigued. And how do you win? She closed her laptop, finally giving him her full attention. You make them second-guess themselves. You make them doubt the little voice in their head that tells them they're right about you. If I had gone off, if I had raised my voice even a little, I would have become the problem, not her. Tooby tilted his head slightly. Ha, that's exhausting. She exhaled, leaning back. You have no idea. A beat passed between them, filled only with the hum of the plane. Marcus, by the way. She studied him for a moment before deciding if she wanted to engage. He seemed genuine enough, but she had learned a long time ago that people's curiosity about her experiences didn't always come from a place of wanting to understand. Sometimes they just wanted a story to tell later. Still, she extended a hand. Christina. His grip was firm, but not overcompensating. Confident. Measured. Nice to meet you, Christina. She withdrew her hand, picking up her glass again. So, Marcus, what's your deal? He smirked. My deal? You've been staring at me for half the flight. You clearly have thoughts. Let's hear them. Marcus chuckled, rubbing his jaw. All right. Here's my deal. I've spent most of my career in finance, and I've been in a lot of rooms where I wasn't expected to be. I know that look the flight attendant gave you. I've gotten it a few times myself. Christina raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. Wealth manager? He let out a low laugh. Private equity. Ah, she said, nodding. So you're used to the quiet judgment. I'm used to walking into a room and watching people assume I'm someone's assistant. That made her smile. And what do you do when that happens? Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now. I let them think it. For a little while. Then I start talking numbers, and they realize they made a mistake. Christina nodded, taking a slow sip of her mimosa. Smart. Necessary, he corrected. She studied him for a moment. He was different. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress her or convince her of anything. He just got it. And that was rare. Marcus leaned back in his seat, drumming his fingers lightly against the armrest. I was curious, though. What do you do that gets you a first-class seat to New York? Christina smirked. I own a tech company. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Really? Why does that surprise you? Marcus shook his head. It doesn't. It just makes sense. Now that was a response she hadn't expected. Oh, she asked, tilting her head. He nodded. You carry yourself like someone who's used to being the smartest person in the room. You expect competence from people, and you have the kind of patience that only comes from fighting battles you shouldn't have had to fight in the first place. For the first time that evening, Christina found herself speechless. She wasn't sure if it was the accuracy of his observation or the fact that he had just said it outright, without hesitation, without trying to soften it. Marcus held her gaze, waiting. Finally, she smiled. You're not wrong. He nodded, satisfied. So, what's the company? Pirius and Dynamics. His eyes flickered with recognition. I've heard of that. I'd hope so, she said, smirking. We design cybersecurity solutions for corporate clients. Some of the biggest firms in the world use our systems. Marcus let out a low whistle. Impressive. She shrugged. It's work. Work that's clearly paid off. Christina nodded slightly, but her expression didn't change. I built something because I had to, because no one was going to hand me a seat at the table. Marcus studied her for a moment, then lifted his glass. To building your own table, then. She hesitated just a second before clinking her glass against his. To never asking for permission, she added. They drank, the moment lingering between them. For the first time since she had boarded the flight, she felt lighter. It wasn't that the frustration had disappeared. It wasn't that Jennifer's condescending tone had suddenly vanished from her memory. It was just that, for once, she didn't have to explain. Marcus understood. And sometimes that was enough. A soft ding overhead signaled the beginning of the descent announcement. The flight was beginning to wind down. Marcus exhaled, rolling his shoulders slightly. You ever get tired of it? Christina didn't need to ask what he meant. All the time, she admitted. Marcus nodded. And yet here we are. Here we are, she echoed. There was something about that sentence that felt bigger than the moment itself. The plane dipped slightly as the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their approach into JF. Christina closed her laptop, finishing the last of her drink. The fight never really ended. But for now, just for a little while, she let herself enjoy the quiet. The descent had begun, and the usual shuffle of passengers preparing for landing filled the cabin. Christina adjusted the strap of her bag beneath her seat, securing it before sitting back. She exhaled, savoring the last few moments of peace before the chaos of New York swallowed her whole. Marcus stretched slightly beside her, glancing her way. Back to business as soon as we land? She nodded. Meetings, client dinners, the usual. He smirked. Sounds exhausting. Christina gave him a knowing look. Coming from the man in private equity? Marcus chuckled. Touche. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants made their final rounds, ensuring everything was in order. Jennifer reappeared, her expression unreadable, but there was no sign of her previous condescension. If anything, she looked hesitant, like she had been mulling something over for the past couple of hours. She stopped at Christina's row and cleared her throat. Miss Pearson. Christina looked up, her expression neutral. Jennifer hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. She glanced at Marcus briefly before continuing. I wanted to apologize again. For earlier. It was inappropriate and I misjudged the situation. Marcus raised a brow, but Christina remained composed. She had been expecting something like this, the corporate male backtrack, the carefully chosen words to smooth things over. She took a measured sip of water before responding. I appreciate the apology. Jennifer looked relieved, though she quickly straightened. If there's anything I can do to make your experience better before we land, please let me know. Christina held her gaze for a moment before nodding. I think we're good. Jennifer gave a small nod before walking off, leaving a trace of tension in the air. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. That was unexpected. Not really, Christina replied, crossing her legs. She had time to think. Maybe someone else on the crew said something to her, or maybe she realized she could have handled it differently. You think she meant it? Christina smirked. Does it matter? Marcus leaned back, considering her words. You always this good at letting things go? She glanced at him. I don't let things go, I just don't let them hold me. A thoughtful silence settled between them as the plane made its final approach. The soft rumble of the landing gear extending beneath them signaled that their time in the air was nearly over. Marcus tapped his fingers against the armrest. So, Pearson Dynamics, what's next for you? Christina smiled, but it was the kind of smile that hinted at something bigger, something she wasn't quite ready to reveal. Expansion, she said simply. He chuckled. That's vague. She raised an eyebrow. That's intentional. Marcus laughed, shaking his head. Fair enough. The plane touched down with a smooth glide, rolling steadily along the runway before slowing to a crawl. The energy in the cabin shifted immediately, passengers reaching for their belongings, stretching, preparing for whatever awaited them beyond the airport doors. Christina reached beneath her seat for her bag, slipping her laptop into it before zipping it up. Marcus watched her. "You got people picking you up?" She shook her head. "Car service. Hotel's not far." He nodded. "Same. Midtown?" "Lower Manhattan." "Ah, so I won't run into you at the hotel bar." She smirked. "Not unless you plan on switching reservations last minute." He grinned, tilting his head. Tempting. The seatbelt sign clicked off, and the cabin erupted in movement. Christina remained seated, letting the rush of impatient passengers clear first. She was in no hurry. She had time. Marcus didn't rush either. As the aisle opened up, Christina stood smoothly, retrieving her carry-on from the overhead compartment with ease. Marcus followed suit, stepping into the aisle beside her. "You in town long?" he asked as they moved toward the exit. "Few days," she said, "then back to San Francisco." He nodded. "Same, but D.C." They stepped into the jet bridge, the cool airport air hitting them immediately, the distant hum of the terminal, the chatter of passengers reuniting, the occasional sharp sound of an overhead announcement. It all grounded them back to reality. Marcus slipped his hands into his pockets, his pace matching hers as they walked. "If you ever find yourself in D.C., let me know." "Drinks on me." Christina glanced at him, her smirk returning. "You assume I drink with finance guys." He laughed. "I assume you drink with people who make you think?" That made her pause, just for a second. "That depends," she said. She stepped ahead slightly, rolling her carry-on smoothly behind her. "On whether you like a challenge." Marcus grinned, shaking his head as he watched her go. The world awaited them both in different directions, for now. But something told her they'd cross paths again. And next time, she wouldn't be surprised. "You said